Hello everyone, my name is Alok Mishra and I welcome all of you once again on my YouTube channel. Today in this video, we will discuss how to take notes in the best possible way as we study poetry. So whenever we read a poem or a series of poems, a poetry collection or a book of poems by any poet, then there are many things that come to our mind all of a sudden, instantly, in a flash. And in those moments, if we don't take or make notes in a well organized way, then recalling all those notes at a later part of our academic year or academic life might be a clumsy task, and we may need to read the poem once again and have all those thoughts once more, and that might not be the same because reading a poem is not the same all the time. So it becomes very important to take the notes in the best possible way, and in this video we will discuss how we can make the note-taking process the best as we read, as we interact with a work of poetry, or we read a poem for any purpose, just for preparing for your semester examinations or preparing for your yearly examinations, or even preparing for a competitive examination like UGC NET. So without wasting any more moments, let's start it. The process of taking notes begin right from the moment you think of reading a poem. For example, suppose you have to read John Keats' poem, The Fall of Hyperion. Now, this is a long poem and we have to begin thinking about it before we interact with the text itself. For example, we have to prepare the metadata. Now the metadata is the data about the data. So before we read the Hyperion, we have to prepare a list of notes about the poem. We can begin with these things: title of the poem, name of the poet, publication date or publication year, the collection in which this poem appeared for the first time, the place, the magazine or the newspaper or any collection in which the poem appeared before it appeared in the collection, the date of that appearance, and then how many sections, chapters or stanzas or parts are there in the poem. If this is a short poem, then the number of stanzas. If this is a long poem, then the number of parts or segments that the poem has. You can also include the data about poet, for example, date of birth of the poet, date of death of the poet, the place of birth of the poet, other major works of the poet, the long or the poetry collections or the famous poems. Also, in the metadata about the poem, you can also include things like the rhyme scheme of the poem, the nature of the poem, whether it's an ode, elegy, eulogy, satire, something like that, the nature of the poem. And then you can also include other poems like that, other poems that may share the theme of this poem, the nature or the art or the subject matter of this poem. And this thing you will get only after reading the poem at least one time completely. So in the metadata, we will record the data about the poem. I will just make a list of it, and I also share a screen on the video so that you can watch it carefully and even make a note if you want. So in any order, when we have to note down the metadata about a poem and also about the poet, we will include title of the poem, publication date or year, who is the poet, name of the poet, the collection in which the poem appeared for the first time, other place in which the poem appeared for the first time, like newspaper, magazine, or another collection other than the poet. About the poet, we will include data like poet's date of birth, age in which the poet wrote this poem, if possible, if you can source that, the age, as in the age in the history of English literature to which the poet belonged, predominant theme or nature of poetry in that age. About the poem, we'll also include things like number of stanzas, number of segments, number of lines if this is a short poem or very famous poem, and also the type of poem, the rhyme scheme of the poem, and names of other a few poems in this subject or about this theme, and also the names of other poets who shared the age with the poet. That will help you in analyzing and interpreting and understanding or studying the poem as a whole in the later stages as you study the poem. The best part about having this metadata ready with you is it can help you immensely in competitive examinations where you have to answer objective questions, and the most important examination is UGC NET. So always prepare the metadata before you actually start reading the poem, and there are some information that you will only feel after you read the poem completely at least once. Now, as we start reading the poem, there are many things that come to our mind as we interact with the text eventually and gradually. We start reading the poem line by line, and there are many things that we may need to make note of. And generally what we do is we just underline and we just note it down. And later when we have to recall these things, we find the words, the vague lines or some sketches. So will it work? No, it won't work. So like in the previous video, we discussed how organizing your notes is important as we study literature. So when we read poem, when we study poetry, then also organizing our notes as we make them or take them becomes very important. So there are certain things that we have to make note of as we interact with the text itself, as we read the poem itself. Now on the screen, you will see many things that will work as the classes or segments or sections that you need to make for organizing your notes as you read a poem. So, as we read the poem, we have to make certain sections in which we will put down our notes. The first one is figures of a speech. Now, you all must understand how many figures of a speech are predominantly used in the works of poetry. Second is symbols. Third is characters. How many characters appear in the poem? Who is the narrator? Who might be the character? What is the mood of the narrator? What are the appearances and nature of the characters as they appear in the poem? There are many things that we'll discuss later. Issues discussed. Now this is what is the theme of the poem? What is the nature of the poem? What are the subjects that a poem talks about or the poet indirectly talks about? So all these things will be put in the issues section. The fifth is notes on the theme. Now these are your notes on the theme, or if you study further, other critics, other poets note on the theme of the poem. And the sixth is overall view on the poem. So this is your overall view that you make up after reading the poem itself, after reading the opinions of other critics and the poets on the poem, and then analyzing everything to make your viewpoints, make your objectives, or make your commentary about the poem. So you will put all these things in the column 6th. So now to elucidate the things, in the figure of a speech column or the very first column, you will put all the comparisons, similes, metaphors, all the linguistic embellishments like alliteration, assonance, and repetitions, refrains. So anything that you find in the figure of a speech section in the poem as you read it, you will put it down in the first section or the first column, that is figures of a speech. In the short poems you will find a few, but in the longer poems you will have to note down all the important ones that you find, so that when it comes to analyzing the poem as a whole, you can easily comment about the skills and writing style of the poet by looking at the kinds of metaphors or similes or analogies that he or she employs in the course of poetry. In the second column that states symbol, you will put all the symbols that you find in the course of reading the poem. Now, symbols are different from figures of a speech. For example, a dove symbolizes peace. A rose may symbolize love or youthfulness or freshness. A fresh garden with blooming flowers symbolizes hope, pleasant situation, happiness in general. So you'll have to be careful as you find and choose symbols that you may need to put in this column, that is the symbols. In the third column, that is characters, you'll note down all the characters in the order they appear in the poem. In shorter poems, you will find only one character many times, that is the narrator or the poet himself or herself. But in the longer poems, or even sometimes on rare occasions in the shorter poems as well, you will find many different characters, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them. And you have to put down the details about every character as you gather in the course of your reading. For example, what is the mood of the narrator? What are the descriptions of the characters who are appearing in the poem? How is the mental state or physical state or the emotional state of the character or the narrator? So you will have to find all these things, the nuances about the narrator's mood, the characters as they appear. Mostly you'll have to do it about the narrator himself or herself, and you'll have to note down every minute detail as you find important in the course of your reading. And this is very important because the mood of narrator becomes vital to describing the situations in the poem, or very important as you analyze the poem or you write a critical summary of the poem, because the viewpoint of the narrator matters a lot. So you'll have to find out all those minute and important details about the narrator or the characters as they appear. In the next column, that talks about issues that the poet discusses in his or her poem, you will note down everything as it appears in the poem. For example, if the poet is discussing the situation of a battlefield, you can put down issues section like a description of a battle scene. If the poet is talking about a garden, you can put in the issues section discussing the mental state of the characters or the narrator. If the poet is discussing about situations of modern society, like people gathering on some place, or people going to office to work, or people being disillusioned about something that is happening, so you'll have to detect the issues as it appears in the work of poetry, and you will note it down in the issues section. Now, in shorter poems, there will be only one issue most of the time. But in the longer poems or poems with medium length, you may find many issues. For example, The Westland, it discusses predominantly only one issue, that is disillusionment and disenchantment of the society with living or the life itself. But there are many smaller and issues at a medium scale that go on to build the corpus of the bigger issue. So you'll have to be careful as you try to find out issues in the works of a poem and note it down in the issues section. Now we reach to the most important, or second or third on the list of the most important columns in our notes section, which is your notes on the theme. So a poem's theme is something that stays constant from the beginning to the end. Your notes on the theme means that you have to put down your observations about the theme of the poem. I have put the example of Death Be Not Proud in the article that I have written for the website englishliterature.education. So you can actually go to the website and read these things. As we discuss here, you can read these things in writing. So Death Be Not Proud discusses the mortality of death, or the feeble qualities or the helplessness of death. In fact, death is the most powerful reality, the ultimate truth in our lives, but the poet discusses death as if it is something that cannot change, or that cannot alter our situation, or that cannot affect us. So the theme is death, but from the viewpoint of the poet or the narrator who is not afraid of death. So you'll have to put these notes as you read the poem and you gather your conscious information about the poem. You have to make notes in the theme section or notes on the theme section, so that when you have to recall your interaction with the poem at a later stage of your academic life, you can easily recall that. So without reading the poem, you'll have a ready-made description of the poet's theme or the poem's theme. So this is very vital, and you have to be the most careful as you make your entries in notes on the theme column of the notes section. So all the best for doing that. Now we move to the next section. Okay, so this is the final column. notes on the poem as a whole, or your observations about the poem as a whole. So now in this section, what you can actually call actually writing a critical appreciation of the poem, you have to write everything that you observed about the poem in this tedious and long process of reading the poem and taking notes. If it is a short poem, all the best, because that will take lesser time. But if it is a longer poem, like Lycidas, or like John Keats's longer poems, or Hero and Linda by Christopher Marlowe, or longer poems by Wordsworth like Prelude, and epics like John Milton's Paradise Lost, then it might be a tedious task. But once you do it this way, you will find that this is fun, and this will help you a very long way. So in the final section, as you observe the poem as a whole, you'll have to note down everything. How did you like the poem? What was the main themes discussed in the poem? What were the major issues that the poet or the narrator picks up? How many characters were there? If there were many characters, like 3 or 4 characters, how are their moods? Are they all equal, or they symbolize something? What are the major symbols used in the poem? What are the social issues discussed in the poem? Does the poem give some universal message, or does the poem represent a personal feeling or personal thought of the poet? So you'll have to find any possible thing about the poem to note down in this section, and ultimately you can actually build up a nice critical appreciation of the poem that will help you in any examination, in the subjective examinations as well as in the objective examinations. So these are the 6 major columns or 6 major categories that you can make to take notes or make notes as you read poem, as you study poetry. So in this video, we have discussed there are major components of notes section as you build up your response to a poem that you have studied. I will just recap everything and I will put it on the screen so that you can have an observation once again, and if you have missed the first part or you have skipped to this part somehow, you'll find it very important, because this is the crux of this discussion that we're having today. Okay, so I'll summarize everything in a quick section so that you can have everything if you are here by chance or skipped. So the note-taking process starts right before you start reading a poem, which is gathering information about the poem you want to read. And this is what we call the metadata notes. In metadata notes, you discuss or you note title of the poem, publication date or year, who is the poet, which is the name of the poet, the collection in which the poem appeared, the date of the appearance of the poem or the poetry collection, or the both if you want, some information about the poet, like poet's date of birth and death, if it is applicable, the age to which the poet belonged, predominant poetry of the period, which is like romantic, philosophical, satirical, or something else, and some important information about the poem, that is number of stanzas in the poem. If this is a long poem, number of segments or sections or parts in the poem, and in both the cases, number of lines in the poem. Sometimes these weird questions are asked to us in the NET examination. Now, there is one more thing that you have to put down in this metadata section, which is names of a few other poets who shared the age with the poet, and also names of a few other poems which share the topics or the themes of this poem that you want to study. Now, once the metadata note is finished and you have zoomed in on the poem that you want to read, you start interacting with the text itself. Now, in that section, you have to make notes as you read the poem, as you interact with the poem. And we have put 6 major columns here. So the first one is figures of speech. So as you read the poem, you'll find many similes, metaphors, comparisons, ironies, analogies, assonances, and other rhetorical devices. So you'll put everything down in the figures of speech section. Then the second section is symbols. So as you read the poem, you'll find many symbolic uses of language by the poet, many symbolic images. So you'll note down the most important ones if this is a long poem, or everyone if this is a shorter poem like a sonnet or a 10 or 12 or 14 or 15 or 20 lines poem. So if this is a short poem, you will put down all the symbols on that column, and if this is a longer poem, then you will note down all the major symbols that a poet has used in this long poem. Now the third section is characters. So in the characters section, you will put down all the characters in the order as they appear in the poem. If this is a short poem, you will mostly find only a narrator. If this is a long poem, then in many cases you will find only the narrator, but in some cases you can find other characters as well. So we'll put down the mood of the narrator, the appearance of the narrator if possible, if applicable, and the appearance of all other characters, mood of all other characters, and if the characters symbolize something. Are they archetypes or are they just characters, normal characters? So in the next section or in the next column, you will put down every issues as you encounter in the course of reading poem. So if this is a short poem, then it might have only one issue throughout. But if this is a longer poem, then you'll find many issues in many different kinds that the poem is discussing. So you'll put down all the major issues in this column. Now the next column is notes on the theme. Now this is your response, your first response to the theme of the poem. So as you have been reading the poem, you will find there is certain theme that runs throughout the length of the poem, even if it's a longer poem or it's a shorter poem. So your notes on the theme means how do you see the poet has been sticking to the idea which he or she has been discussing in the poem. What the poem is about, what the poem discusses as overall. So all these things will feature in the notes column, notes on the theme column. Now the final column is overall view of the poem. So now this is your overall response, critical response to the poem as a whole. Now if you write this wonderfully and carefully, this can serve as a critical summary of the poem, which includes everything. Poets' use of rhetorical devices, poets' use of similes and metaphors or other figures of speech, the poet's style of writing, the poet's use of rhyme or lyrics in the poem, the poet's use of symbols, the poet's theme, which whether it is broad, whether it is universal or personal or local in nature. And then you can also discuss the serious issues like if other poets were doing the same thing, if any other poem in any other age was published that discusses the same themes or the same issues as this poem discusses. So if you do this final thing carefully, then you can have the best note possible in any standard, and you can discuss it with other friends, you can discuss it with your professors to further polish it, and you can keep it down in your academic locker so that you can use it anytime you want, and you can have the best possible view of the poem anytime you want to recall it. So friends, this was today's discussion as we have discussed how to take or make the best possible notes as we study poetry, as we read a poem. So whether you are reading a short poem, whether you are reading a longer poem, epics like Milton's Paradise Lost or Wordsworth's Prelude, or even in Hindi like works by Nirala, the longer poems by Sumitranandan Pant, or the longer poems by Dinkarji. So in any language, if you study poems, then you can use these suggestions to take or make the best quality notes that you can actually help others by supplying that thing. So this was it for today, and we'll be bringing more study guides or more note-taking guides for the novel as well as for the drama genre. So thank you for watching this video, and I will just be back with more videos like this very soon. All the best, take care, have a good time. Thanks again.